Ontario Presents also specifically recognizes the legacy of colonization embedded in many aspects of the performing arts sector, including the technologies, structures, and ways of thinking we use every day. Until recently, many Indigenous communities are legally prevented from practicing their own cultural and artistic traditions. And to this day, Indigenous people still have less access to the performing arts, both as audiences and artists. Other barriers, such as cost and physical accessibility, also disproportionately impact Indigenous people. Actively dismantling the colonial approaches embedded in our work and our tools is critical to reconciliation and Indigenous resurgence. Next slide. So I encourage you to go to nativeland.ca to learn more about our ancestral lands in which we live and to determine how we can be part of a larger conversation about reconciliation and decolonization. I personally live in Oakville, Ontario, originally home to the Anishinaabeg Nation, the Haudenosaunee, the Attawandaron, and the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. My relationship to this territory is felt in the mornings when I walk next to the Bronte Creek through the Moccasin Trail. Dotted along the path are beautiful Indigenous stories and illustrations that give thanks to Mother Earth, water, plant life, and animals native to my neighborhood. It provides me with a really wonderful opportunity to reflect on and appreciate our shared land. This session is the second webinar in Ontario Presents Continuing Learning Series in support of the digital document From Seed to Season, How to Grow as a New Young Audience Presenter. The document was written to support new and emerging presenters in rural, remote, and underserved communities to achieve their vision of connecting artists with children and youth in their community. The first webinar in January was just a quick overview of the document and how its resources could be applied to a new young audience presenter. But today, this session is all about exploring two key elements of the presenting journey and offering an opportunity for viewers to ask questions and share experiences. Today, I'm thrilled to be joined by Dr. Terry Lynn Brennan and Sandy Irwin to lead our discussions today. I'm your host for today's webinar. My name is Joanne Churchill, and I currently work as a special projects consultant for Ontario Presents. I'm also the author From Seed to Season and the project lead for the new Young Audience Presenter Project, which aims to support new and emerging presenters. This project has been funded by the Canadian Arts Presentation Fund. My background is in developing opportunities for children to access the performing arts in both communities and schools. So today we'll be discussing two key elements from the e-document From Seed to Season that are foundational components to every new and emerging presenting series or organization. We'll be talking about how to implement EDIAD considerations into a new YA series. Now, for the purposes of this discussion, EDIAD refers to equity, diversity, inclusion, accessibility, and decolonization. We will also be talking about identifying and recruiting new volunteers in a challenging post-pandemic world. We will start the webinar with a conversation with each one of our guests, followed by an opportunity for the viewers to ask questions. So please hold your questions until our guests have finished their component. So our first guest today will be Dr. Terry Lynn Brennan. Welcome, Dr. Brennan. She is the Administrative Director of Ontario Presents and the CEO of Inclusive Voices Incorporated. Today, she'll be sharing her knowledge about implementing EDIAD into a new presenting series. Welcome to the webinar series, Terry. Before we start the session, would you be able to share with our participants a little bit about yourself?
Nioi, Joanne. Sego, everyone. Sego's gonna go. Sego Guego. Wat Wanuradon, Terry Lynn Brennan Jungens, Gunyagahaga British, Najoto Dun, Goweno Gweski, Goweno Day, Gunyugari, Ishwigan Najidaron. So hello. Lovely to sit around the circle with you all for the afternoon here in Ontario right now. It's not quite that in Saskatchewan, but so fabulous to greet our prairie sisters and brothers to this conversation. I just identified in my ancestral language of Mohawk my name. I identified I live on Wolf Island off the coast of Kingston in Eastern Ontario. I identified I'm of mixed heritage, Mohawk and British. and that my family does come from Six Nations of the Grand River, Brantford, Ontario, which is at the other end of Lake Ontario than where I currently reside. I am occupying, living, working on the lands of my ancestors. I was born and raised at this end of Lake Ontario as opposed to the other end where everybody else in my family was born and raised. And I'm very happy to still be part of this land every day and enjoying its splendor and its bounty. At the very beginning of my introduction in Mohawk, I've always been advised to ask the question, "Skunagoa se Oguego?" And it is a question. It's a question basically asking all of you that you've come hopefully to this meeting with an open mind and an open heart, and with the respect of everyone in the circle, acknowledging that everyone has walked a different path than yourself, and so experiences and thoughts and feelings are going to be their own, and every one of those criteria of an individual should be valued equally and weighed in a respectful way, without judgment. And so that creates a space where we're all welcome to share in conversation, hopefully in an open and transparent and brave way. And I look forward to discussing further any questions that you might have after my brief conversation with Joanne. Okay.
So we'll start with the questions. So in preparation of this webinar, you and I discussed previously, if you could provide any overarching advice about implementing IDIAD considerations for a presenter, it would be emphasizing prioritization. So can you give us some everyday examples of how a newer emerging young audience presenter can prioritize IDIAD as they're starting out their presenting journey?
Absolutely. I just realized I didn't finish my introduction appropriately. My pronouns are she and her, and I'm actually in a kind of a forest green sweater. I've got very long sunset color earrings on under my headset, which is white. And my background is an image of a longhouse, one of the longhouses at Six Nations of the Grand River, my homeland. And it's and I'm not actually there right now. I'm in my office, but I love to have that as my background and just reclaimed it because it was lost in my computer for so long. And I have glasses on as well. So yes, the biggest challenge for any of us working within equity right now is that reconciliation, as much as I'm not a fan of the word, but reconciliation actions, which is the most common known kind of phrase out there amongst settlers, have fallen along the wayside because recovery from the pandemic has become now more of a transactional and a monetary need for folks. So things like reconciliation and prioritizing IDIAD work is on the side, if not off the desk. And that really is a frustrating factor because although yes, everybody needs to eat and sleep with a roof over their head. I appreciate that, but it's also the responsibility of people to recognize that, especially if they are a settler, the benefit of being able to eat healthy food, breathe fresh air, and have the access to housing, the possibility of housing in a safe way is at the cost of the Indigenous peoples who land you now occupy. And so it's still a bit of a disrespectful thing to not prioritize IDIAD at the end of the day. And that's where it's this thing I hear all the time. I just, I want to, but I can't, don't have the time. And I shrug it off because it should always be a priority because that's the right thing to do. It's the responsibility of all settlers. Again, in the context of the fact of the damage that's been done for hundreds of years now. And so things that people can do outside of at least dedicating time every, if not every day, every week, to doing something towards expanding your knowledge of Idiad is extremely important. And much like any conversation I have with settlers right now, it's not up to Indigenous peoples or even any person of color to educate settlers or non-Indigenous, non-people of color of the differences in experience. We're burnt out, we're overloaded. There is definitely a ratio, way too many of settlers compared to the rest of us. And so it's really quite simple. Educate yourselves, start to read information, start to, there's lots of excellent books out there, and they're not all textbooks. There's a lot of good reading material to start to understand a little bit more about the lens of diversity and looking through a different, a different perspective of life and life experience when you've been racialized from day one. And then talk to other settlers about how to support your continuing education, but also then how can you actually actively support in your communities? Can you platform more Indigenous or people of color, or for that matter, LGBT, people with disabilities, or people that are disabled, I should say, that there's a range of folks in our communities who are truly not being served appropriately. I refer to them as equity seeking. And so it really is a matter of understanding the space as a settler who has privilege that you take up, and recognizing that every space you take up is a space that is not available to someone who is equity seeking. And it becomes now a recognition of, okay, well, how can I get out of the way? How can I step back and support those other voices who, quite frankly, have never been decision makers? They've been excluded at decision-making tables, boardroom tables, CEOs, higher management, across the board of all sectors. And so we need to start to give more consideration to once we educate ourselves, moving folks into positions of opportunity. And this can be, through inviting people, but not as volunteers. We all volunteer too much, but I think we've gotten to the point now where there needs to be compensation for folks who are bringing a specific lens and knowledge to your table. Otherwise, it's token. And so it kind of is this trickle effect of not only understanding your place in the spectrum, and for Indigenous knowledge, I always direct people to Thomas King's Inconvenient Indian as the first place to start, because it's an easy read, it's hilarious, it's sad, and it's truth. And once you get through that, then you'll open yourselves up. I mean, anything by Thomas King is worth the adventure. Richard Wagamese, amazing fiction writer. There's just so much out there. There's so many films now. There's so many available TV shows even. There's lots of ways to educate yourself on the Indigenous perspective, but also on other equity seeking perspectives. And we'll start there.
So the next question would be to you, Terry. We talked again also in our previous conversation that you had mentioned, and this is a quote, I actually wrote down the quote that you said. You had mentioned that there needs to be a movement to change the current landscape and to shift in the power dynamics in order for idiotic considerations to become effective. You spoke a little bit about that just right now, but could you kind of expand a little bit more on how a young audience could, a presenter, be part of this change? What can they do?
Absolutely, exactly. Um, so becoming, a young presenter in particular is an extremely, extremely um, honoring, honorable position to be in towards changing the landscape of power dynamics. Certainly, youth today, younger youth, are being educated a lot more on equity deserving identities. Our school system is changing, not fast enough necessarily, but at least it's heading in the right direction towards that. And the key is, though, we need to start to create more role modeling of those opportunities for youth and bringing in diverse, equity seeking, opportunities on stages. But even so, I sit and I've had this conversation with Joanne and others. When you look at an audience and you look and see who's in your audience, and perhaps um, in smaller areas you might have audiences that really represent one dynamic of a demographic of your community. And the rationale is that I often hear is, oh well, because that's who our community is. But I always sit and go, you mean to say that there's no other equity deserving person in your community? And I've had folks tell me that there isn't. And then I walk into the local grocery store, and every person behind a cash register is a person of color. I walk into a convenience store, I walk down the street to a fast food shop. Um, the people that are equity deserving are overlooked because they're often in these positions of menial labor, if you will, because again, that totally represents the systemic nature of how equity deserving people are just forgotten, you know, not seen in communities. And so we need to really start to recognize, how do we change our own eyes? How do we change our eyes to see the visibility of others? And then let those other folks of equity deserving um, ideas begin to dictate change, begin to become the decision makers at our organizations, in our audiences, in all of our facets of how we coordinate what we do. Um, and certainly with young audiences, in your schools, and the schools that maybe you reach out to, or the food bank you maybe reach out to, or the early years center that maybe you reach out to, if there, the opportunity to expose and role model different ways of thinking and doing um, is huge. There are so many opportunities of young people's works that cover the gambit, and in different languages these days. I mean, I certainly know from the Indigenous side, there's always an opportunity for Anishinaabe-Moan work to be shown in the north of Ontario. There's even Inuktitut work that's out there to be shown in many of the again northern places, but also Ottawa has the highest Inuit population outside of the north. Um, and so we have to just start to say, who's not coming to my shows, who am I not engaging, and then seek out an opportunity to listen, learn, ask a lot of questions. There is no stupid question ever. And be sincere and authentic in wanting to, again, understand the space you take up towards having someone else maybe step in to at least one of the spaces you take up in your daily life. Obviously, I'm not asking you to disappear at all, because we have to have our allies, we have to have our support network, and we all still have to live together and get along. So it's really about learning how to share in an equitable towards equal way. And right now, the equity sits in the hands of equity deserving folks, and the need for others, especially settlers, to sit back and listen and be directed and be given guidance, to how things maybe could evolve for the better of everybody in a community. And I guarantee that audiences are changing. We know that the demographic is changing in the sense of the population is getting older, and we need to continue to keep performing arts relevant in our communities and alive in our communities. And we have to therefore mold what is happening in our community demographic, and not just serving those older folks as they are aging, but bringing in the new lifeblood that will confirm performing arts stays on the landscape for at least another half century, if obviously forever. But we need to start to work within those opportunities of exploration, within and across our neighborhoods and communities.
Actually, I have another question. It's not actually part of the slide. So it's actually from what you were just talking. So it's also a little bit of a tie-in to the From Seed to Seed document. And there's a section in there that talks about getting to know your community. And that's just kind of what a little bit what you were you were chatting about, and listening and asking questions. So would you be able to maybe I'm always about real life examples and being very, giving folks who are here something to put in their toolbox that they can use tomorrow. So would there be something that you could say that to help our viewers engage with their community that they don't that the parts of the community that they don't already know? How would they go about doing that? Is it inviting people to informal focus groups? Is it just listening sessions? Is it kitchen conversations? How would you go about having those conversations with new groups?
Yeah, and not having a specific example of your community it always makes it very hard to answer, because there isn't a pan approach. Every community is different. And I would say that, once you begin to identify equity deserving folks in your community, figure out how they are how are they connecting amongst themselves for groups. Communities that I've worked in that have smaller Spanish or even just Mexican communities, or out west, I do a lot of work in BC and Alberta, and so there's huge Filipino populations in many of the small communities across Alberta, and they are very vibrant and active communities, even though they're not recognized within the mainstream of the performing arts sector. And so my advice is to, is there a particular, in this case, Filipino community group? Is there a particular place, such as a place of worship, that they gather? And then it does become kitchen table conversation. I mean, obviously, you're not going to walk into a church or a mosque or a temple and just say, hey, I'm here, come to my venue. Or, hey, I'm here, I want to entertain your kids. It's a matter of really being humble in how you learn and how you approach things, and putting yourself out there. And it comes back to the very well regarded statement that's out there these days. It's you have to grow to be comfortable with being or to grow to be comfortable in being discomfortable. I can't think of the actual word language to it right now. I'm sure one of you, Sandy or Joanne, can come up with the comment. But that's where we're at when it comes to approaching scary situations. Nobody wants to be embarrassed, and nobody wants to insult. But if you don't put yourself out there and start to make these conversations happen, then you are insulting. You're insulting by your inaction. And so it really does come down to finding opportunities to meet new people. And even as I said, I am one, I've been one my whole life where if I see someone I want to talk to and then they are a cashier or they're a cab driver or they're, picking up garbage on the street, I am going to just go and say, "Hey, how you doing?" Out of curiosity, do you do anything performance wise, or do you know where I could find out more about? It's not, it's actually really humbling, and it's actually really lovely because 99% of the time, that person, that recipient is going to take the time to talk to you and take the time to say, "Oh, okay, yeah, sure." And we live in actually a really lovely country that way. Everyone is pretty approachable. There is something to be said about the Canadian standard of always apologizing, even when, we're not in the wrong. And I certainly go around the country, and the moment I say I'm sorry, people recognize I'm Canadian. Right away. Not Mohawk necessarily, but definitely Canadian. And so it's one of those things of putting yourself out there, um, to learn and to listen and to spread the news of what you'd like to do in collaboration with others. I was discussing with a funder recently about engaging in some Indigenous folks for work, and there's an assumption about creating a product or creating an opportunity to give to Indigenous peoples or to give to equity deserving peoples without their input to say that they want it or that they, or they need it. And so it really does. How do you know what someone who is Indigenous, if you're not you're Indigenous yourself, knows what they want or what they need or how they want it or where they want it until you ask those questions? There really needs to be a shift in moving out of assumptions and moving out of the savior attitude of just being here to give, because that's not actually effective uh, or authentic. I hope I answered your question.
Mhm. So, well, this will lead into other folks here who would have any questions for Terry. Please use the chat function, or if you don't want to speak on camera, or use the raise your hand function, and we'll try to get through as many questions for Terry as we possibly can. So let's see.
Yeah.
Okay, let's see what any questions? Sorry if I cannot see any. Sandy has raised her hand. Any question, Sandy?
I do. I'm a recovering children's presenter, so I often think about my audiences, and I'll be talking about this later, but can you maybe think about the responsibility we have as presenters to introduce equity-seeking members as performers to our audiences as well as audience members? And I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Absolutely. I mean, Sandy, I love that you're a recovering young person's presenter. Uh, Absolutely. And I would say in many ways, that's kind of the easiest thing presenters can do is to seek out equity deserving role models for folks in their community. And that certainly can be a first step for presenters if they're looking for opportunities to make those connections with different members of your community by putting representative artists on the stages, or in the backyard, or on, under the gazebo, however you want to create these opportunities of connection and engagement. But again, I would also say, and certainly with Indigenous presenters, it becomes one of these scenarios where having flexibility also of the routine of your space or the spaces that you occupy need to kind of go hand in hand, because certainly with a lot of different equity seeking folks, there might be different needs and special needs. From the Indigenous community, there might be a request for smudging, and that should be an option. There might be a request for different folks with who are disabled to have different apparatus or tech changes that should be addressed and supported. Again, bringing equity deserving folks to your stages doesn't mean putting them into the settler model of performance, and understanding that there is a difference to that, and teaching and learning within yourself how to work with different folks. And it is a learning experience that one should not be afraid to try. It should be something that change is our lifeblood and will keep us alive. If you don't change, you will die. And so I'm very, I'm very supportive and nurturing of making these changes to our repertoire in place, and physicality, infrastructure, but also in our approach and our understanding. Again, not making assumptions, but asking questions. What do you need? What will make this opportunity of artistry better for you or special for you as an artist? And as there's just so much potential for then and certainly Spark, Sandy's also here from Spark, and Spark and Ontario Presents right now, we're partnering in what's called the Slow Touring Project to allow artists an opportunity to spend longer periods of time in one space, so that artist maybe gets an opportunity to work with the community outside of that one show on that one night and that one stage. These types of opportunities and experiences, especially with equity deserving folks, can be really, really impactful to a community as a whole, not just that one night of audience goers. And so yeah, I hope that answered your question, Sandy. Okay, thanks.
Any other questions for Terry at this time? I'd also like to say,
I don't know.
Sorry?
Oh, sorry, Joanne. I don't know if this is the perfect opportunity or not, but for those who are familiar with the Ontario Presents network, I've created a ongoing program. It's in its second year now, called Cedar Tea Breaks, and every 2 weeks I'm now making myself available through a registration link on our website, that if you have IDIAD questions or ideas that you want to have a conversation about, I'm just going to be hanging out online through that link, and available to chat, and available to have those conversations, which Robin, I think that might be a good way for us to connect, because I was so happy to see you on the call today. But it's one of those things that I might also have an opportunity to show really good webinars about IDIAD work that I know is going on from colleagues of mine, every other time. But I'm also continuing with my pairs also. So either way, check it out. Cedar Tea Breaks, Ontario Presents. Go onto our website to learn more about that if you want to continue to have IDIAD conversations after this as well.
And also, Terry, also on the website, Ontario Presents websites, they're in the resources section. There's also a lot of different resources that are available on this whole conversation. And I'd recommend everybody to kind of take a look, not only what's available in the e-document from Seed to Season, but also there's an enormous amount of wealth of information also on the Ontario Presents resources section of their webpage. So thank you very much, Terry. I'm going to move on to our second guest now. Thank you. And so our next guest is Sandy. And Sandy Irvin is going to talk to us a little bit about volunteerism. And Sandy is the chair of Spark Roseau and the manager of marketing communications, for Ottawa's Chamberfest. Previously, as she mentioned, she is a recovering artistic director and chair for On Stage for Kids Children's Concert Series. And the board, she's been on the board for Puppets Up Festival. Sandy is here to discuss some best practices and success stories about the challenging topic of engaging volunteers in our post-COVID environment. So welcome, Sandy. And before we continue, can you please share a little bit about yourself and your background in presenting for young audiences?
For sure. Thank you for having me. First of all, I'd like to say that I am coming to you from the heart of unceded, unsurrendered Algonquin and Anishinaabe territory. I am in the Ottawa Valley, and that has been cherished for time immemorial. That watershed feeds and nourishes us. The place where I present most of my concerts is right on the shores of the Great Mississippi, which is not just a trade route, it's a travel route, it's a highway. But I like to think that it's also the place where people gathered by the side of the river at night to tell stories, and that we're just part of that long tradition, and that we're honoring that tradition when we do that. I'm a middle-aged white lady. I have some gray coming into my brown hair. I wear glasses. Today I'm wearing a red shirt. And I am proudly wearing a fishing lure that belonged to my grandfather. As a children's presenter, I'm going to talk about my recruitment path, and it's going to affect how I advise you to go on with your recruitment paths. I was recruited by a friend, and in my opinion, that is how most of the recruitment happens in small towns, is through word of mouth. I think it's the most powerful thing. And I was recruited by a friend at the entrance to nursery school, because that's the age my children were at. They're grown now, they're out in the world. But at the time, I was doing a lot of drop-offs and pickups and volunteering my shifts at the time at the nursery school, because that's the model we worked under. I could have been recruited at kindergarten. I could have been recruited in the grocery store. I could have been recruited anywhere in the community by someone who knew me, who was already involved with that group. Now you folks are apparently starting new and budding children's presenting groups, but you have those same networks existing already. A small town is by definition, or a reserve or any other community, is a connection of webs, and your volunteers are out there waiting for you. What you need to do is think about your connections and think about who you're connected to, who can help you connect with your people. For me, as a young children's presenter, I came as someone who was already interested in the arts, who was happy to help. So I had been to a lot of concerts, and I had helped put on other kinds of shows. Oddly, in my student years, I put on a lot of punk shows. And that experience was still valuable, because there's not much difference between a mosh pit and a children's show, honestly. There's a lot of energy going around, and you have to channel it. Our model for presenting was we used existing school buildings. We used the school gym. We used the school gym mats so that our smallest people could sit at the front. And they all learned to tuck themselves in quietly and sit at the front. And they could laugh and cheer and wiggle. They weren't constrained by chairs. And then as people got bigger, we had chairs behind, and those chairs helped hold adults and bigger kids. That making space for people at the front is the core of children's presenting, and keeping that sense of laying the table, of making the space, which is really what Terry Lynn was also talking about. That humility is going to go into your volunteer recruitment as much as it goes into the inclusion of equity seeking groups. So there's humility, there's putting yourself out there, like she said, and then there's making the space. So in volunteer recruitment, to me, what you're looking about is building some capacity through your networks. You can put out the word through formal channels if they exist in your community, if you have a newspaper or a radio station, or even a church bulletin board or church newsletter. Those tools will work. But if people don't hear from you, they're not going to come to you. So they need to know who you are, and that involves the humility and the putting yourself out there. In an urban environment, there's a lot of formal volunteer recruitment channels. My day job is with Ottawa Chamberfest, and we work with Volunteer Ottawa. We have software that manages volunteers. We have software that says we have these opportunities open. that doesn't happen in a small town the same way. But if people know that something's coming up and that you need help, help will arrive. Whether it's a church supper, whether it's sandwiches for a funeral, the word will get out. Some of that is tapping into what I like to call big anti-energy, and it's using existing networks of people who phone each other, and we'll spread the word that way. But a lot of this is the informal networking that happens in small towns. So for 10 years, I presented children's works, and then I moved on to presenting for grown-ups because my kids outgrew that audience. And that's going to be the challenge you're always facing, is that people are going to come in at the young age, they're going to stay with you for a time, and they're going to move on. And just as your audience does that, so do your parents and volunteers. I should probably let Terry get it, or not Terry, sorry. Joanne get a word in edgewise, because I know she has some questions for me, and I just went straight into the pet team.
Actually, you did. You started, you're doing my whole shtick for me. Thank you very
Yeah.
much. So if we go to the next slide, you actually pretty much answered this question, because my question was going to be about identifying, engaging new volunteers. And you kind of did a really nice link between what Terry was saying about understanding and knowing your community. And the community for a young audience presenter is really sometimes the core, is the parents, guardians, caregivers, whatever that makeup looks like for that child, and really understanding that the core is really the child, and understanding everything else kind of works out from there. We might just be able to go kind of, unless you want to expand on that a little bit more, we could go on to the next question.
There's one other thing I would add to this.
Sure.
When I came to my small town, I'm a former city person. I've always had rural connections, but I chose a small town to settle in. And that meant I was a newcomer in the community and a new face. So I didn't have existing networks of, like you would in a church community, or an existing community where you'd gone to high school with everyone and everybody knew everything about everybody. Many small towns and other communities across the province are navigating these changes. And volunteerism is a great way to knit community together. And it's a great way to make friends quickly, and offering those opportunities to people who aren't from here. Whether they're just moved into a new development, just bought the old Simpson house, just moved in down the street, is a great way to help them get into the community. And as well as being involved with Volunteer for Kids, I was also involved with Puppets Up, and we recruit all ages for that festival, and newcomers to town from all communities are a very important part of that mix, and it really helps people become a part of that community. You may meet resistance from people who have always been here and always done things a certain way, but I think that inclusion is a really important piece of the puzzle.
So I think we have all talked a little bit about how after the pandemic, things have really changed quite significantly. Everybody is working at maximum capacity. Everybody's overloaded. The same volunteers have 3 other volunteer jobs that they're doing. And so an organization's mindset needs to shift accordingly to look at non-traditional methods of volunteer identification. Can you explain, you've kind of talked a little bit about newcomers and so forth. Could you explain how to implement some strategies to help presenters find little outside of the box, non-traditional volunteers in this new environment?
Sure. So there's a couple of channels, especially in a rural community, that you really need to tap into. You need to work with your schools. And as a youth presenter, you've kind of got a built-in market there anyway. That's going to be working with the schools, part of your marketing strategy as much as it is part of your volunteer recruitment strategy. But also, at least in Ontario, every high school student needs a certain number of volunteer hours to graduate. And people tend to say, oh yeah, we'll just get some students. Like they just show up in a box and they're ready to go. And that's not how it works at all. So the sooner you reach out to the person at the high school who's in charge of those students, the better equipped you'll be to find the kids who actually want to work with you. I always treat those volunteers as not just not just semi-willing workers, but a responsibility. We have a responsibility to bring them on so that they become the next generation of volunteers, just as we have a responsibility to bring our audiences on so that they become the next generation of arts audiences. So giving them an opportunity to engage with more than moving chairs, to thinking about your process and how things work in the arts may mean that 10 years down the road, you're looking at a new director or a new performer, not just a kid you worked with someday. So school's one channel, friends is another channel. Our post-pandemic communication is different than it was before. We make extensive use of social media in the way that we did not. And I know that particularly in northern communities, social media came with free infrastructure for communications that was very quickly adopted, so that a Facebook group is a really powerful tool for reaching people. Whether there's a community Facebook group already set up or whether you set one up for your organization, either way, you have something with quick channels that people can use their phones to get onto if they have Wi-Fi or signal. And quickly and easily tap into that communications network. So that's a strategy I would not want to leave behind in recruitment. But I think those are the core value of speaking directly to people and letting them know what you're doing is going to show up regardless of your communications means, whether it's verbal at the grocery store or online on social media. Your message should be consistent, and it's okay to say you need help. Does that answer the question?
A little bit, yeah. Going back to the C2C document, there's a part of it that talks about understanding your why and being able to communicate the story behind your organization, even if it's fledgling. And if an organization can think about those and articulate why you're doing this, what's the incentive, what is your origin story, then you can put those kind of big feely kind of concepts in your way of communicating to folks. And when you can communicate, in that kind of emotive, compelling way, more people are more likely to connect with you and want to be part of that kind of organization. Do you want to talk a little bit about how you can communicate in different ways in that emotive way?
Oh, that's a tough one. It's definitely not something to take for granted. I was just thinking that in my day job, we talk about marketing and sales funnels a lot, and there are volunteer funnels too, which is a bit different from communicating the big feelings. I think that's consistent across the board. But often the volunteer funnel is starting by asking someone to help with a simple and concrete task to get involved. And for me, that starts with taking tickets, because it has a beginning, a middle, and an end, and it's a relatively compact task. And then someone can see how your organization works and assess if they have the energy and commitment for a bigger role. Because every organization that does children's presenting, it's almost exclusively volunteer run. And there's a range of day of show jobs that are one thing. And then there's year-round jobs on a board that are another thing. And I wouldn't treat recruiting the same for those two different aspects as the same lumpy thing. So you want to create the emotion and excitement of why you're presenting for children and how you're introducing kids to the very idea of culture. And if you're lucky, you're introducing them to more than one art form. And isn't that a privilege to take a kid who's only ever seen TV to seeing something live in front of them? And that's a beautiful thing. But it's a very different ask to say, hey, can you come help tickets? Or can you come help set up mats too? Hey, can you come be my treasurer? So you should be consistent throughout, but it's sometimes it's that funnel of starting with a small role and then graduating to a bigger role. And that's one of the reasons we have recruitment of young people, so they can grow up into volunteerism. But I'm not sure I could say that, yes, we have to understand the why, and yes, we communicate the why in everything we do. how that affects a particular method or strategy of communication. It's just about consistency and clarity. And I'm very much an advocate of transparency. So whatever you're doing, be honest and transparent with it.
Exactly. Just to further what you were just saying earlier too about volunteers and having a little bit more contained, smaller projects. It's great also when you're asking you know, volunteers to do different things in a non-traditional way, such as a virtual network, virtual volunteering, and doing things remotely rather than on site, and having very job specific tasks that can be given out to, you know, a variety of a younger generation that can, you know, help you do research or do more things that are in a digital platform that are self-contained. It doesn't take, you know, months and months of work. It can be done in a short period of time. It is beginning and middle and end. Can also work really well for you know, the younger generation, not just high schools students, but you know, younger volunteers in their 20s and 30s who don't necessarily have the huge amount of time, or even, you know, young parents who are, you know, knee deep in childhood and who have limited times in the day. So actually we've just whipped through all our questions. So
Okay.
we have been you've been very great in talking about finding volunteers and new ways of communicating with them and so forth. So I would really like to hear if there's any questions from the group to Sandy. If there's any questions, you can put it in the chat and or raise your hand. Fran from Iroquois Falls said here in her community, they try to involve the real estate agents. They hand out some of our promotional materials on their behalf of the Iroquois Arts Council, which is great. And of course, word of mouth is the best, as you have just mentioned, Sandy. So thank you,
That
Fran,
is
for
super
making.
smart, Fran. I
Yeah.
love that. I was going to
So-
say one other thing, recognizing that often your volunteer base will be parents and or guardians and or grandparents. Your meeting times might look different than another volunteer group. You might be meeting during the day and you might be at someone's house where the kids are literally running around whilst the grown-ups are in a kitchen sitting around a table putting together lunch and talking at the same time. And one of the nicknames for our groups, which was invented by the kids, was called On Stage for Meetings, because as far as the kids were concerned, going to the meetings that their parents attended was at least as much as fun as the show. And I have some really fond memories of that time of, you know, stuffing hot dogs into buns and handing them out to 10 or 12 kids so they could run back around the kitchen again. As we sorted things out, as we who were maybe part-time parents or stay-at-home parents or parents who had a day off work to do a meeting or who were on a Saturday, we would find ways to get together. We're connecting with each other as real people in a way that you don't get to in your work lives. And I am still friends with so many of those people. And that time of connection and community is one of the things that attracts people to volunteering. So make sure you're making space in your volunteer model for people to be themselves. And if that includes you're bringing your kids because there is no childcare, then that's part of your model. It's really important. Because they're why we're doing it. So
Absolutely.
this should be part of it.
Any other questions from the group? Let me just see. I don't. Any hands, any questions in the? Well, if anybody's thinking, but I'll just say one thing as I'd like to, in response to both Terry and what Sandy was both saying about understanding the community and being humble and honest and listening to the community and really knowing who's out there so that can build bridges for ADIAD and also for building bridges and connections for volunteers. I'd encourage you all to look at the chapter in From Seed to Season It's called Understanding Your Community, and it's on page 12. There's some really great little tips and tricks of how to start that conversation, what it looks like, and there's lots of different digital links that can give you additional resources on how to start that process. And it's not up to one person. I think that's something that your leadership team or the foundation members of your presenting series or group or team can work together, because it's not just a job for one person. It's really a job for the group to engage in, and it's not going to take a day. It's not going to take a week. It's an ongoing process of learning and listening and understanding. And your community is going to evolve over time. And so this is, again, an ongoing kind of process. I'd also like to direct you to page 17 of the document, which is the chapter on using empathy as the core of equity, diversity, and inclusion. It is not the end all and be all, but it's a good start for some great information on how to deal with the concepts that Terry was talking about initially at the beginning of the conversation. And then I'd like to direct you to page 29 of the document as well. It's all about volunteering. And it does also give you lots of different, wherever you are in your process, it can help you, help with devising not job, but role descriptions for your volunteers, how to, manage your volunteers once you have them, some recruiting practices, some best practices from other organizations. So I encourage you to look at those parts at your leisure. Share that with your team as well, because, knowledge is only good if we share it amongst others. And so again, if there's anybody who has any questions for our lovely panel. Okay. Wow, we're right at 2 o'clock. So I will go to the next slide, and I'll have an opportunity to say thank you so much to everybody for taking their time to come to today's webinar. And a sincere thank you to Terry Lynn and Sandy for sharing their wealth of knowledge and, of course, their real world insight. I'd also like to thank the Department of Canadian Heritage for their financial support. And if anybody has any additional questions, just feel free to reach out. My email is there. And additionally, if you know of any other volunteer groups or teams or organizations in your community or even beyond who might be interested in becoming a young audience presenter, please share this information or have them contact me, and I'd love to talk to them. And as I said earlier, I really do encourage everyone to go to the Ontario Presents website to access not only the e-document from Seed to Season, but all the other essential presenting resources that are on the site. Just go to the top of the dashboard, it'll say resources, and there's just enormous amount of information available for there's webinars, there's e-documents, there's slide decks, there's reports. It's just a wealth of information. So before we go, I just also like to say that our next webinar session will be in March. It will be it's called A Time to Reflect. It'll be on March the 20th at 1 p.m. And it'll be an opportunity to have a discussion with some of the participants that I've been working with in the new Young Audience Presenter project. So I'd like to say goodbye to everybody and thank you very much for your time today. And I will be sending some resources after early next week, the transcript of this presentation plus the actual video recording. So thank you very much. And again, thank you to Terry and to Sandy. Bye-bye.